It was January of 1945. The trees in the forests of the Ardennes stood like bony silhouettes against a sky heavy with snow. The wind was sharp and cold, sweeping falling flakes across the forest floor. Under a camouflage net, inside a frozen M10 Wolverine tank destroyer, Private Jack Callahan watched through a fogged periscope. His breath came in short, ragged clouds. His gloved hands trembled, not from fear, but from the bone-deep cold that seeped through every inch of metal and every bone. Just 800 yards away, a column of German tanks snaked through the woods. There were 12 of them, mostly Panzer IVs, with a single Tiger I at their head. Half-track personnel carriers filled with infantry rolled behind them, and fuel trucks brought up the rear. They were heading for a vital crossroads, a road that, if taken, would cut off the supply and reinforcement routes for the 101st Airborne Division, currently surrounded at Bastogne. Callahan had no orders, no permission to fire. He had been told to wait, to observe, and to report. But he saw what was about to happen, and he made a decision. Without a single command, without authorization, Jack Callahan squeezed the trigger, and everything changed. The rules of engagement. 3 days earlier, in a drafty farmhouse near the Belgian front, Jack Callahan sat hunched over a cold metal table as his commanding officer briefed the crew of the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion. "Nobody opens fire without confirmation from command," the officer said, his voice flat. "I don't care what you see. I don't care how close they get. We do not give away our position until the order is given." The room was silent. The men nodded. But beneath the surface there was tension. Everyone knew the enemy was moving, and moving fast. Outside, the Battle of the Bulge was raging. On the 16th of December, under the cover of fog and snow, the German army had launched its last major counteroffensive on the Western Front. It was called Operation Wacht am Rhein. The goal was simple: to split the Allied advance in two, hold key cities, and force the front command onto the defensive. They had struck with over 200,000 men, more than 1,000 tanks, and with absolute surprise. American lines buckled. Some units disappeared overnight. Friendly positions changed by the hour. And in that chaos, many commanders feared the worst enemy might not be the one in front of them, but friendly fire from behind. So the rule was clear: wait for orders. For Callahan, that meant an observation post. He and his 3-man crew had dug in on a ridge overlooking a forest road north of Bastogne. They had good cover, a clear line of sight, and a freezing view of the valley below, but they had no permission to engage. Day and night, Callahan scanned the terrain. Through his frosted scope, he noted tank tracks, counted pines scarred by treads, and sketched enemy movements in a notebook his mother had sent him months ago. He wrote down everything: range, azimuth, wind speed, but he did not fire. One day, he tracked a lone panzer for nearly an hour as it crept toward a ravine. No orders came. The tank passed. A fire burned inside him, but discipline held. He knew his job. He knew the cost of a wrong shot. One errant shell could mean a dozen dead American soldiers, or an exposed position that would bring down the counter-battery fire of an entire German battery. But as the hours dragged on and more enemy hardware moved through the trees, the question changed. Was waiting truly the safer option? Callahan wasn't reckless. He was precise. He had studied the German columns like a mathematician studies patterns. He knew how they moved, how they positioned their support vehicles, how they relied on tight formations, and more importantly, he knew where to hit them if and when the time came. He just didn't know yet that the decision would have to be his own. Who was Jack Callahan? Jack Callahan was not born a soldier. He grew up in the steel country of Pennsylvania, where the winter wind could peel the paint off a barn and the summer heat baked the fields until they cracked like dry bread. His father was a mechanic at a small factory in town. His mother taught high school mathematics. Jack grew up surrounded by gears, grease, and graph paper. Even as a boy, he saw the world in angles. He could tell you exactly how far away the factory smokestack was by the length of its shadow. When most kids were playing with slingshots, Jack built his own with a system of pulleys and counterweights, trying to figure out how far he could launch a stone with absolute precision. He didn't join the Army because he wanted to fight. He enlisted in 1943 because it was his duty, and the Army offered a trade, rations, and a future. He got the trade. The rations were modest. The future depended on whether he survived this war. By the time Callahan hit the hedgerows of Normandy, he was 22 years old and looked 5 years older. His first taste of combat came in the dense bocage, where the enemy could be 10 yards away, and you wouldn't know it until they opened fire. He had watched his friend, Mike Santoro, burn alive when a Panzer shell hit their half-track in a roadside ditch. He had seen another, Bill Jensen, vaporized by a mine outside of St. Lo. After that, Callahan stopped believing in luck, or orders, or safe distances. He started believing in patterns, in routine. He studied how tanks moved, where they stopped, how long it took a turret to traverse. He started carrying a small, spiral-bound notebook in his jacket pocket. Every German vehicle he encountered, he sketched, noting vulnerabilities, blind spots. He didn't talk much. The other soldiers nicknamed him the Watchmaker because when he did speak, it was brief, direct, and usually timed to the second. But when it came to gunnery, he was lethal. Not flashy, not fast, just accurate, predictable in the best sense of the word. As far as the Army was concerned, he was a good gunner, disciplined, smart, calm under fire. What they didn't realize, what even his closest crewmates didn't fully see, was that Jack Callahan was also a thinker, a tactician, not just a trigger puller, but a man who could see the battlefield as a chessboard. And in 3 days, this quiet draftee with a mind obsessed with angles would rewrite the rules of engagement with a single volley of firepower. Because sometimes war doesn't reward the ones who follow the instructions. It rewards the ones who understand when to break them. What he was facing. On the morning of January 19, 1945, the fog over the Ardennes was thick and low. It clung to the branches like smoke. Visibility was limited. Sound was distorted. But through his periscope, Jack Callahan saw them. First, the silhouette of a Tiger I tank, the unmistakable beast with its long barrel and snarling boxy shoulders. Then another, and another. The German column was moving down the forest road like a steel serpent. 12 vehicles, maybe more. It was a textbook armored assault column, neat, dense, disciplined. At the head, acting as a battering ram, was the Tiger, capable of punching through almost anything the Allies had. Behind it followed 3 Panzer IV tanks, each one fast, efficient, deadly. Then came 2 half-tracks packed with infantry. Behind them, the support vehicles, ammunition trucks, fuel tankers, a field kitchen. Even the tail of the column was covered by a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, a sign that they expected contact and were ready for anything. Anything except for one unauthorized American gunner in an M10 Wolverine. The road they were on was narrow, barely wider than the column itself. On both sides were steep, wooded embankments. The dense trees hemmed them in. There was no room to maneuver, no room to disperse. To Callahan, it wasn't just a road, it was a trap. But here was the problem. Jack had no orders. No one else could see what he was seeing. Radio contact with his battalion's forward headquarters was weak, intermittent, or non-existent. The only way to contact command was to shift position and risk being spotted. By the book, he was supposed to observe the enemy, report their course, and let air power or artillery take the lead. But Callahan wasn't watching a column on the march. He was watching a blade aimed directly at the throat of the American defensive line. That road they were crawling down led directly to the crossroads at Noville. If they took Noville, they would flank the defenders of Bastogne from the north. The 101st Airborne Division, already surrounded, would lose its last major supply artery. The result would be a catastrophe. Tens of thousands of American soldiers cut off in the freezing cold. And still, the tanks kept coming, calm, confident, protected by the belief that the American forces were disorganized, scared, and stretched too thin to respond. They were half right. Jack Callahan was scared. He was cold. He was isolated. But he was not disorganized. He was calculating. He knew that if he fired too early, they would scatter. If he hit the wrong target, the others might get away or return overwhelming fire. But if he fired with precision, at the right vehicles in the right order, he could do something most officers would consider impossible. He could take an entire armored column apart, and he would have to do it without a single word from command, without support, without permission. He licked his lips, reached for the elevation handwheel, gave the formation one last look, and waited for a moment no manual had ever prepared him for. The unauthorized pattern begins. Jack Callahan had never fired without an order. Not once. Not in training. Not in France. Not even when his instincts had screamed at him to pull the trigger days earlier when that lone panzer filled his sights. But now, looking at the perfectly exposed German armored column moving forward like clockwork, he realized something. Waiting was no longer caution. Waiting was suicide. And so, with no radio contact, no green light, and no backup, Jack adjusted his angle, held his breath, and fired. But he didn't aim for the lead tank. He aimed for the third one. The armor-piercing round left the barrel of the M10 Wolverine with a deafening roar that shattered the silence and kicked up a wave of snow. It hit the 3rd Panzer IV squarely in its side. The explosion sent a shockwave through the trees. A pillar of fire and black smoke erupted into the fog. Metal screamed. The entire column ground to a halt, but Callahan wasn't finished. As his loader slammed the next round home, Callahan shifted his position slightly, 5 yards to the left, just enough to throw off any German gunner looking for his muzzle flash. Then he fired again, this time at the 6th vehicle. The explosion tore through a half-track full of infantry. Its fuel tank ignited instantly. Bodies were thrown into the trees. The fire spread to the dry underbrush, lighting the forest floor in patches of orange and black. The Germans were no longer halted. They were panicking. The Tiger at the head of the column tried to reverse, but the column was too tightly packed. The Tiger's crew was yelling and gesturing furiously, trying to clear a path. But behind them, the rest of the formation was now bottled up, blinded, burning, and trapped. Callahan reloaded again. His crew, now fully awake and understanding what was happening, didn't ask questions. They followed his lead. He fired at the 8th vehicle, a fuel tanker. The result was instant and biblical. The explosion rocked the hillside, sending tongues of flame into the sky like a volcanic eruption. The force of the blast knocked 2 nearby infantrymen off their feet. The fireball silhouetted the tanks like ghostly shadows. From a distance, it sounded like a full-scale artillery ambush. In reality, it was one man, one gun, and one hunch. But the order of his shots was not random. Callahan had been studying German doctrine for months. He knew their reliance on tight formations, knew the logic of their layout, fuel and support at the rear, armor at the front, infantry in the middle. By taking out the 3rd vehicle, he had created a physical roadblock. By hitting the 6th, he had jammed the middle. By taking out the 8th, the fueler, he had blocked their retreat and ignited the chaos. It was a chain reaction, a firing pattern, a surgical dismantling of the German tactical structure. Every shot was a scalpel, not a hammer. The Germans, now confused and cut off, began firing wildly into the trees. Their machine gunners raked snowdrifts and empty trunks. The infantrymen took cover behind the burning hulks, unsure of where the fire was coming from. To them, it felt like a trap, an organized ambush by an entire battery of American tank destroyers. But there was no ambush. There was no battery. There was only Jack Callahan and a crew that had stopped asking questions. While the enemy scrambled, Callahan shifted position again, using the forest terrain like a sniper. He knew how to use angles, knew how far his gun could reach without exposing itself too much. Every new position was chosen for cover, for elevation, for maximum confusion. He wasn't just shooting, he was dismantling, and every explosion was another page torn out of the German field manual. Destruction in the forest. The woods had been silent moments before the first shell. Now they were screaming. Trees cracked and fell from the shock waves. Snow, fire, and shrapnel filled the air like confetti from a hellish party. Callahan's third shot had ignited the fuel truck. The fourth hit a half-track that was trying to reverse. Its wheels were already spinning in the icy mud when the shell hit, sending the chassis into the sky in a mangled arc of steel. The German Tiger at the front was stuck. The crew was desperately trying to reverse, but they were trapped between the flaming wreckage and the vehicles behind them, which couldn't move without ramming each other. Their tight, disciplined formation, so effective in open country, had become a steel coffin inside the forest road. From Callahan's vantage point, everything was moving in slow motion. He could see soldiers shouting, waving their arms, confusion turning to panic. The German infantry began to scatter into the woods, abandoning their vehicles. Some took cover behind trees. Others ran through the snow, tripping and sliding on the frozen roots. One officer climbed on top of a tank to get a better view and was cut down by a burst from Callahan's coaxial machine gun. The crew inside the M10 Wolverine was now sweating not from fear, but from sheer physical exertion. The loader's hands were raw. The assistant gunner's voice was hoarse from calling out coordinates. The inside of the tank destroyer smelled of grease, hot metal, and cordite. But Jack Callahan was ice, focused. Every shot he took was a calculation, not adrenaline, not rage, just pure, practiced mathematics. He changed his position after every 2 shells. Not far. 10 yards here, 20 there. But it was enough to make the German gunners second-guess their aim. The smoke helped, the fog helped, the terrain helped. But the real advantage was that they thought he was more than he was. The Germans believed they had stumbled into an ambush of several units. Some guessed 4 tank destroyers, others said 8. There were even reports of American artillery batteries in the hills, though there were no such batteries in that sector. The truth was, it was a single M10 Wolverine with a 3-man crew and a gunner who was supposed to be following orders. By the 30th minute, the road was clogged with burning steel. At least 5 vehicles were destroyed. 3 more were disabled. The surviving crews of the fuel trucks and support vehicles at the tail of the column had already turned and fled back down the forest path. The Tiger had finally managed to traverse its turret, swinging it toward the ridge where Callahan had last fired from. Callahan didn't flinch. He waited. He knew the Tiger's armor was thickest at the front, but weaker on its sides. And if you knew the exact moment it turned, when the hull exposed just a sliver of its flank as it shifted, that was your window. The 5th shell left the barrel and found its mark. A bright, hot flash seared the Tiger's side. For a second, it held. Then the internal ammunition cooked off. The entire turret lifted straight up in a pillar of fire, landing several yards from the chassis. The explosion was so powerful, it knocked the German anti-aircraft gun at the tail of the column off balance. Its stunned gunners abandoned their weapons and ran into the woods. The smoke was now rolling into the forest like low-hanging clouds. The wreckage glowed in the gray morning light, and the road that had once been an artery of armored might was now a burning bottleneck of destruction. One of Callahan's crewmen looked at him and said, "We ain't going to get court-martialed for this, are we?" Callahan didn't answer. He just reloaded the next shell. The job wasn't done yet. The German view? The ghost battery? Hours later, during an interrogation at a makeshift American prisoner of war camp, a captured German lieutenant, his face smeared with soot, his uniform half burned, his eyes glazed with shock, struggled to find the words. He spoke in fits and starts, stammering, pausing. "There were many guns," he said in broken English. "Maybe 6, maybe more. An entire battery hit us." The American intelligence officers looked at each other. There was no battery. There wasn't even a full unit. There was just one M10 Wolverine and a gunner who had officially never been given permission to fire. Other German prisoners described it differently. Some said it was an ambush by paratroopers with anti-tank rifles. Others claimed the Americans had laid mines and booby traps, evidence of sabotage, not artillery. One kid, barely 20, swore he had seen muzzle flashes from 3 different directions. But the flashes had all come from one source, from Callahan, moving after every shot. In their confusion, the Germans had started to invent enemies that didn't exist. Fear was filling in the gaps. Even veteran tankers reported seeing silhouettes of American armor deeper in the woods. In the chaos of burning wreckage, smoke, and collapsing command chains, they imagined what they could not identify. It wasn't cowardice, it was psychology. They simply couldn't believe one man had done this. It was impossible to them that a single gun could have struck with such timing, such precision, and such devastating effect. And in a way, they were right. It wasn't brute force, it was surgery. Callahan's decision to fire on specific targets, the 3rd, 6th, and 8th vehicles, had followed a logic no German unit was prepared for. German doctrine taught them that American forces were slow to react, overly reliant on air and artillery support, and dependent on orders from the top. Americans were supposed to be effective in numbers, not in improvisation. But Callahan had broken that expectation. He had thought like a German commander, and then he had struck like a ghost. One prisoner described it as if the trees themselves had opened fire. Another claimed to hear a whistling sound, which could have been a delayed memory of the shells or just the wind in the trees, distorted by fear. When American troops moved in to clear the road hours later, what they found stunned even hardened veterans. The wreckage looked like the aftermath of a coordinated airstrike. The vehicles, piled up like dominoes, were burnt-out husks, fused together by the heat. Frozen bodies were scattered in the snow, some still clutching rifles. Trees were splintered like toothpicks. Tank treads were twisted sideways, dug deep into the earth. But above all, what was missing, what made it so strange, was the absence of any dead American soldiers. There were none, because there had only been one gunner. From that day on, the survivors of that German column would refer to the incident with a single phrase: the ghost battery, insubordination, or genius. For 48 hours, Jack Callahan waited to be arrested. After the firing stopped, the smoke cleared, and the Germans had either fled or burned. He sat inside the M10 Wolverine, unmoving. His loader offered him a swig from his canteen. He didn't answer. The adrenaline was gone. Now the fear set in. They had broken a direct order. They had opened fire without authorization. And no matter how many tanks were burning, the Army had rules. Back at battalion headquarters, Callahan submitted his report. His commander, a captain named Davies, read it without a word. He turned the pages. Callahan's sketches, his range estimates, the diagram of his firing sequence. His face was a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You know," Davies said finally, "if this had gone wrong, if even one of those had been friendly—" Callahan nodded. He offered no excuses. "I knew what I saw," he said simply. Davies stared at him, then let out a breath. "Nobody authorized this, Callahan. You understand that?" "Yes, sir." Davies didn't reprimand him, not yet. Instead, he said, "Go get some rest. I have to send this up the chain." Up the chain meant division command, which meant scrutiny, which often meant punishment, especially for an enlisted man who had operated outside of protocol. Callahan went back to his crew. They were quiet, too. No backpatting, no celebration. Everyone was waiting for the hammer to fall. But it didn't fall. Not right away, because something else happened first. Scouts from the 101st Airborne arrived. They came through Noville 2 days later, their faces gaunt, their eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep and life in a foxhole. They had expected to find that forest road swarming with armor. Instead, they found twisted German wreckage. They asked which unit had destroyed them. Davies said it wasn't a unit. It was one gunner. The story spread faster than orders. In mess tents, in supply lines, over battalion radio chatter, men started talking about the kid from Pennsylvania who had single-handedly destroyed a tank column. Some embellished the story. They said it was 10 tanks. They said he did it with 5 shells. They said he used ricochets like a pool shark. But in the midst of the budding legend, the official investigation began. Division intelligence studied Callahan's field notes. They interviewed the loader, the assistant gunner, even tried to reach higher command to confirm Callahan's radio situation that day. They couldn't prove insubordination because there was no clean record of orders received. The lines had been jammed. Callahan's crew had tried to report. There had been no answer. What they could confirm was the butcher's bill. 7 vehicles completely destroyed. Another 4 disabled. 0 American casualties. One strategic objective, the northern road at Noville, held. One cut-off and besieged airborne unit reconnected to its supply lines. And one decision, made in silence without permission, had kept that corridor open. Davies was called in to get the final decision. He was expecting a reprimand. What came back instead was more unusual. The division commander said, "Don't include this in the official summary, not yet, but tell your gunner, we'll be watching his work." Callahan didn't get a medal, not then, but he wasn't court-martialed. In fact, he was quietly assigned to train other gunners on the theory of firing patterns, how to disable columns with sequence, not just brute force. No one said the word hero. No one saluted. But he was asked to diagram his decision-making process, and his diagrams were sent to the Ordnance School at Aberdeen Proving Ground. That's when he knew. They weren't just forgiving what he did. They were studying it. Davies came up to him one evening weeks later as Callahan was cleaning the breech of a recoilless rifle. "You know," Davies said, "I was ready to report you for insubordination." Callahan looked up. Davies shrugged. "But then I read that line in your notebook, the one about controlled collapse. What did you mean by that?" Callahan wiped his hands. "When you pull one stone from a wall," he said, "the rest comes down if you know where to pull." Davies smiled. "Well, next time you decide to bring down a wall, just give me a heads up." Callahan didn't smile back. He just nodded. Because to him it wasn't a victory. It was a solution, a calculation, a necessity. And in the back of his mind, he knew it could have gone the other way. He was at peace with that. But war doesn't always punish insubordination. Sometimes it learns from it, the pattern that changed doctrine. Jack Callahan never asked to be remembered. He didn't keep journals. He didn't pose for pictures. After the war, he went home to Pennsylvania, married a girl named Elena from the next town over, and opened a small repair shop. He fixed tractors, built grain silos, and taught his son geometry by drawing angles in the dirt with a stick. He never once called himself a hero, but others did. Because years after the Battle of the Bulge, the Army quietly began teaching what they called asymmetrical sequence engagement, a technical term for a deceptively simple idea. Don't aim for the head. Aim for the collapse. They used a single engagement outside Noville in Belgium as the case study. They showed grainy aerial maps of the forest road, diagrams of the wreckage, the layout of the vehicles, the firing trajectories. No names were mentioned. The file was unclassified. but buried in artillery doctrine manuals most officers never read. Still, cadets at Aberdeen, and later at West Point, studied it because it worked, because it saved lives, because it changed the understanding of what a single gunner could do. Not with firepower, but with geometry, with logic, with the willingness to act when the orders went silent. Years later, a colonel who had studied Callahan's fight as a young lieutenant summed it up. He didn't break an order, he acted beyond it. It was the ultimate paradox. The man who had disobeyed the chain of command had become a model for battlefield flexibility. His unofficial firing pattern was later integrated into Cold War doctrine, specifically for training tank destroyer crews to disable Warsaw-packed armored columns in Central Europe. The concept: create artificial choke points by selectively targeting vehicles, then use the enemy's own formation discipline against them. It was revolutionary, and it had come from a kid from Pennsylvania who had never been to college. Decades later, a military historian stumbled upon the original field report filed by Captain Davies. Buried in a cardboard box of World War II action reports, it was stamped with a faded red line. The historian tracked down Callahan, then in his 80s, quiet and a little hard of hearing, living in a modest house with his wife and a cat named Patches. He asked Jack about that day in the forest. Jack didn't speak for a long time, then said, "I remember the trees. I remember how quiet it was before the first shot, like the world was holding its breath." He didn't talk about victory or glory or regret, only precision, only necessity. When asked why he didn't wait for an order, he said, "Because by the time the radio worked, it would have been too late." He paused, then added, "I didn't break the rules. I just stepped outside of them for a minute, just long enough to do what had to be done." That answer never made it into the official history books, but the historian remembered it. And now, perhaps, you will too. Jack Callahan didn't win the war, but he saved a road. He saved a unit. He saved a moment. And in a war, sometimes, that is everything. He reminded an army that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it calculates, and sometimes it squeezes a trigger. Not out of defiance, but out of a deeper sense of duty. One gunner, one decision, one pattern, and a whole German column kneecapped.